Ladies and gentlemen, we will now commence the second plenary on defense and strategic studies for the 15th International Research Conference under the theme National Security through Strategic Stability. We have 5 eminent speakers here with us today to present their thoughts and ideas on our theme for the conference. Without a doubt, this will be an interesting and intellectually inspiring session.
I would like to call upon Brigadier Upali Rajapaksha, Dean, Faculty of Graduate Studies, to introduce the chairperson for the session.
Recording in progress.
Ambassador Bernard Goonetilleke, former Secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Vice Chancellor, I welcome you all back to the afternoon segment of the KDU International Research Conference 2022 Defense and Strategies Plenary Session 2 on the theme National Security through Strategic Stability. It is my pleasure to introduce the chairperson of the session, Ambassador Retired Bernard Goonetilleke, Chairman, Pathfinder Organization, to the audience. A graduate in history and postgraduate in international relations, The Hague, Bernard Goonetilleke spent nearly 4 decades as an officer of the Sri Lanka Foreign Service. Following his retirement, he was appointed chairman of the Sri Lanka Institute of Tourism and Hotel Management, SLITHM, and later chairman of the Sri Lanka Tourist Development Authority, SLTDA, and Sri Lanka Tourism Promotion Bureau, SLTPB, which positions he held concurrently from 2008 to 2010. His career as a Foreign Service officer began in 1970 and included posting to Sri Lanka diplomatic missions in Kuala Lumpur, New York, Bangkok, Washington DC, Geneva, and Beijing. He had several positions in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, including the post of Director General Multilateral Affairs from 1997 to 2000, and ending as Secretary, Ministry of Foreign Affairs from year 2003 to 2004. During his career, ladies and gentlemen, he served as permanent representative of Sri Lanka to UN in Geneva from 1992 to 1997, during which period he was concurrently accredited to the Holy See and as permanent representative of Sri Lanka to the United Nations in Vienna. Later, he served as Sri Lanka's ambassador to the People's Republic of China from year 2000 to year 2003, during which assignment he was concurrently accredited as the ambassador to People's Republic of Mongolia and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. He also served as acting permanent representative of Sri Lanka to the UN in New York from 2004 to 2005 and ended his diplomatic career as ambassador to the United States of America from 2005 to 2008. Following the signing of the ceasefire agreement between the government and the LTT in 2002, he headed the Secretariat for Coordinating the Peace Process. We called it SCOPP, and functioned as one of the 4 members of the government negotiating team. Since May 2010, he functions as chairman of Pathfinder Foundation and director of several companies associated with the Mercantile Merchant Bank. While thanking him for being here with us today, accepting our invitation, I now cordially invite Ambassador Retired Bernard Goonetilleke to the stage and chair the plenary Defense and Strategic Studies Plenary Session 2. Sir. Meantime, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to call upon our eminent guest speakers in this plenary. Professor Rouben Azizian, Director of Center for Defense and Security Studies in Massey University, New Zealand, joining online. Dr. Zeng Xiangyu, Associate Professor and Research International Coordinator, Institute of South Asian Studies, Sichuan University, China, joining online. Lieutenant Colonel Hassan, Amir, Defense Advisor at the High Commission of the Republic of Maldives in Colombo, Sri Lanka, joining physically. Mr. Shanaka Jayasekara, Program Coordinator for the Global Maritime Crime Program, Regional Office for Southeast Asia and the Pacific, Thailand, joining online. Dr. Chris Ogden, Senior Lecturer, Associate Professor, School of International Relations, University of St. Andrews, Scotland, joining online. Ambassador Retired Bernard Goonetilleke will also introduce the presenters of the session to the audience. Sir, over to you.
For the introduction, I'm very happy to be with you here this afternoon. This is the 15th International Research Conference conducted by the university. The focus subject, I am told, is economic revival, national security, and sustainability through advancement of science, technology, and innovation. And the plenary 2 is on the subject of discuss national security through strategic stability. Stability is a very important subject for all of us, whether individually, in a community-wise, and nationally, internationally. Stability is very important. When we, having gone through a period of instability a couple of months ago, we know how important the subject to us. And the subject today is actually strategic stability. Sri Lanka has taken pride in saying that we are located in a strategic place in the Indian Ocean. True, we can take pride in that. But of course, with that, there are responsibilities that come with that kind of a situation. And also, I think, given in the month of August, we also experienced some kind of issues relating to strategic stability involving Sri Lanka and the neighboring countries. Here I am referring to the visit of Chinese research ship and all what we had to face as a result. So in time to come, I think this strategic issue is going to be very important for all of us. And if we are, unless we are very careful about our location in the Indian Ocean and what is going on around us, there will also be a price to pay. So, having said that, I would like to invite the first speaker for the day. He is Professor Rouben Azizian, Director of Center for Defense and Security Studies in Massey University. Professor Rouben joined CDSS in December 2015 after spending close to 14 years at the US Defense Department's Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Honolulu, where he lectured and conducted research on the Asia Pacific regional security architecture, diplomacy, and confidence building, security sector development, as well as US, Russian, Central Asian, and Oceania security issues. Before joining APCSS, he taught at the Department of Political Studies at the University of Auckland, 1994 to 2001. From 1998 to 2001, he was also the president of the Auckland branch of the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs. Prior to becoming full-time academic, he had an extensive career in the Soviet and later Russian Foreign Service, which included assignments in Nepal, as attaché, third secretary, and very interestingly in Sri Lanka as second and first secretary, and New Zealand as council and deputy chief of mission. Professor Azizian has published several books as well as numerous books, book chapters, journal articles, and working papers on Asia-Pacific security issues. He is a member of the editorial board of the scholarly journals Asian Political and Policy, Central Asian Studies, Asia-Pacific Journal of the Marine Science, and Education, and Russia and Asia-Pacific. With that introduction, I would like to invite Professor Azizian to make his presentation. Here I would like to mention that each presenter will have 15 minutes for the presentation, and I would urge them to keep to the time so that we will be able to complete our afternoon program in time. Thank you. You have the floor, sir.
Ayubovan to all of you. Mr. Chair, you mentioned my time in Sri Lanka, and when I was there in the 80s, I did speak much better Sinhalese. I'm hoping to improve my linguistic capabilities one day. Thank you very much for inviting me to address this prestigious conference, which focuses on research issues. I think it's very important for all of us, whether it's a defense university in New Zealand or in Sri Lanka or elsewhere, to understand what's going on in the defense and security world today. Are we able to deal with the many issues and challenges around us? Are we innovative enough to use new tools and new theories and new systems to deal with what is becoming an avalanche of security problems and security issues? I will say with some assertion and may begin, hopefully most of you will agree, and I don't know what my panel colleagues will be focusing on, but I would suggest that there is no other problem today in the world that is more undermining and dangerous and subversive to strategic stability than the Ukraine problem. The Ukraine war, Ukrainian crisis, or Ukrainian conflict, depends how you define it, is, in my opinion, the biggest threat we are challenging today. So while I think I will get some majority votes for to agree with me that Ukraine problem is a major challenge to strategic stability, there could be some maybe difference of perspectives on whether this strategic issue is of equal importance to national security issues and interests of various countries. Some would arguably say that Ukraine problem affects Europe more than Asia. Others may disagree with that. So New Zealand is 17,000 kilometers away from Ukraine. And yet, every day, the main channel in New Zealand, TV channel, includes a piece on Ukraine. I have to say that New Zealand TV programs don't really cover much of international stories. New Zealand is a relatively successful and stable country, so most of our discussions in radio and TV have to do with domestic issues. And yet, Ukraine is regularly in the news. And this is a country that is 17,000 kilometers away from us. So that tells us something, perhaps. So increasingly, in the last few years, every New Zealand defense and security strategy document states that the relevance of distance is diminishing, that New Zealand, surrounded by oceans, it cannot feel safe anymore in the world that is so interdependent, in the world that has significant existential issues such as climate change, and now possibly some other. So there is one recent development in the Ukraine crisis which I think should alert all of us to the need to be more involved in the conflict, one way or the other. I'm not suggesting militarily, but politically and diplomatically, because the leader of the Russian Federation today is using the N word, which is nuclear weapons. And the response back from the United States and the West is that this will be a catastrophic decision and there will be a retaliation by the West. So are we talking about potential nuclear war? President Putin said he is not bluffing. So if the West is not bluffing, we are, again, after so many years, after a Cuban crisis, on the verge of a nuclear exchange or nuclear war. So what can be more threatening to national securities of the countries in the world, because it will be impossible to avoid the implications, direct or indirect, of this nuclear exchange. So while New Zealand government's policies say the distance issues are irrelevant, on the other hand, when New Zealand talks about Russian aggression in Ukraine, in my opinion, this is not just a message to Russia, it's a message to other countries in the region of the Indo-Pacific, Asia-Pacific, that New Zealand and other countries are starting to fear as potentially, possibly using the same approach, aggression, invasion, use of violence and use of force. So distance does matter, on the other hand, because when New Zealand speaks about Russia, New Zealand also has someone else in the region in mind. Secondly, distance does matter because Russia's main argument in favor of launching this special military operation, is not even called a war, after even mobilizing 300,000 troops, is protection of its sphere of influence. So when we hear about Russia being worried about NATO expansion, it's only part of the issue. Russia didn't really do much to stop Finland or Sweden from joining NATO, but Russia is adamant that Ukraine should never be a member of NATO. Why? Because Russia still, the government follows the realpolitik approach, which is we have our sphere of influence and we should protect it. So distance does matter, after all, for some countries who believe that we are still living in the world of rivalry, competition, and every major power needs to protect its own neighborhood, the sphere of influence. So are we back to realpolitik after many years of talking about climate change, about talking about importance of collaboration against COVID? Are we back to the same might is right and realpolitik approach? Well, of course, most defense universities are probably comfortable with teaching realpolitik. That's what security and defense experts and analysts actually spend most of their time on, right? These traditional threats and issues. And yet there was time a few years ago when we were starting to broaden the parameters of our understanding of defense and security, talking about things that were not in the traditional realm of security. Well, I'm not sure we are retreating back to the realpolitik, because look what's happening. After Henry Kissinger makes a statement on Ukraine in a very realpolitik traditional context, which is we should have never supported Ukraine. This is Russia's sphere of influence. We should stay away from that. He was immediately criticized and attacked to the extent that he completely reversed his perspective and later on even suggested that Ukraine should be admitted to NATO. Why? Because Ukraine has stirred huge waves of public involvement and public protests that I don't think we have seen before. So it is not just the leaders of the Western world that are wanting to stop the aggression. I would suggest that some of them would probably prefer to follow a quieter approach because they depend on oil and gas supplies from Russia. Some of them have been personal, or are very few of them personal friends of Putin, and yet they are using a much stronger language by the day or by the hour, because the public in their own countries is putting a lot of pressure. So we have an existential problem, in my opinion, because nuclear exchange is an existential problem, and yet we have different voices. Some say enough of talking about Ukraine. We have other issues. We have, I'm sure, in South Asia or Sri Lankan national security perspective, there are very important issues and challenges around us. So why are we spending so much time on Ukraine? My suggestion would be that, with all respect to national securities of individual countries, and nothing could be more important than stopping a potential nuclear war. So are we dealing with an aggression, or are we dealing with self-determination? Russia has launched what many call an aggression and invasion, and yet Russia calls the referendum in the Donbass and other regions of Ukraine as a right for self-determination, and is referring to the United Nations Charter. So how can we resolve issues where we can't even agree on what the issue is? Ukraine has divided many and also consolidated many. So it's a major international factor. It has divided countries into groups of staunch supporters, countries, a much smaller number that either support or sympathize with Russia, and a larger group which is sitting on the fence and waiting to see what happens. In my opinion, the ones that are waiting to see what happens are probably the least helpful in the current situation, because I think we cannot sit on the fence and wait what is happening. So there are various frames of this conflict and problem, and let me just go through some of them, and just to indicate that the Ukraine problem is not a Europe problem. It is not a pure European problem or post-Soviet problem, because it has so many features that resonate in other parts of the world, including in the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific. So we are dealing with, in Ukrainian situation, with a legacy of empire, Soviet Union, and the leaders of Soviet Union not coming to terms with the loss of a strong superpower status and empire. So policies, imperialist policies are still around, right? We have imperialist policies of major powers, some declining, some starting to rise, some retreating somewhat, and that creates a significant tension. The other dimension of the problem is minority rights. Did the Russians in Ukraine have some issues and challenges after the independence of Ukraine? Yes, they had. Does invasion, a full-scale invasion and support of minorities help resolve this? I don't think so. Because imagine a neighboring large country walk into another country under the pretext of supporting the minority rights of this country, take over part of the land, declare that land part of your own country, and then say, and now get out of here, and if you don't, I'll use my nuclear weapons, if you have them. And we have some of us have neighbors who do have nuclear weapons. Imagine that scenario. So it's not just a Ukraine thing, it's a precedent that we should be very much aware of. Ukraine is also about decolonization. If Soviet Union was an empire, then Ukraine and many other ethnic groups, they felt they were decolonized. And when they got independence, what happens? They experienced rise of nationalism. I'm sure in Sri Lanka, I don't have to remind everyone present about the importance of decolonization and possible impact on the rise of nationalism and ethnic tensions. So this is what's happening in Ukraine. Rise of nationalism led to certain tension between the majority of Ukrainians and the smaller groups and the Russians or Russian speakers. Some refer to this conflict, not just a conflict between Russia and Ukraine, but a conflict between the United States and Russia. Or there is also suggestion that we are witnessing a war, a conflict between the authoritarian countries and democratic countries. So it's kind of a, ideological warfare. Our Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern refused to accept it as a ideological warfare, not wanting to publicly offend or suggest that China is part of that conflict on the side of the authoritarian nations. But the jury is out on that one. So we have lots of security and defense issues, but our responses and policies are not always adequate. We are somewhat late. We recognize that security is comprehensive, but the way we operate and respond is oftentimes very linear. And so my final couple of comments, because I'm running out of time, is that what are the implications for security studies and defense studies? After all, we are talking on a university platform. Are we, as I mentioned very earlier, are we using the right tools? Should we be a little more innovative in our theoretical approaches? Is realpolitik still relevant and in the current circumstances? Or is just kind of liberalism is the answer, which on the other hand doesn't really take into account some issues of ongoing competition and rivalry. So I hope this conference will raise profoundly all these issues, explore, and come up with hopefully some recommendations and responses in terms of how do we survive in this volatile world. And if I may suggest also, how do we make sure that smaller nations like Sri Lanka and New Zealand and others have a stronger voice? Because letting the major powers sort these things out between themselves is not something that we should be doing in the 21st century. So I urge experts and academics in smaller nations actually maybe to work more collaboratively with each other to see whether we can enhance the role of smaller nations in what is a very increasingly unstable international security environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you. The issue is whether it is a special operation or a war. We have a serious situation in Europe, which affects the entire world. And of course, we still ask ourselves what prompted this particular conflict to begin and where it will end. Perhaps during our discussion period, we will be able to focus on those aspects. The next speaker on our list is Dr. Zeng Xiangyu from the Institute of South Asian Studies, Sichuan University, China. Dr. Xiangyu is an associate professor and research international coordinator at the Institute of South Asian Studies, Sichuan University. He also serves as coordinator, Sri Lanka Studies Center under ISAS. Lead researcher, Indian Ocean Studies Program, with a special interest in South Asian security and diplomatic studies. Dr. Zeng is at present in charge of a national social science program, Maritime Security Strategy of India, implications to China. He was visiting scholar in Pakistan, India, and University of Macau in middle of 2011 to early 2014 and up to 2016. He has published 6 books and some 50 papers in both Chinese and English languages. I invite you to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Invitation offered by this university as well. And I have prepared a very brief, PPT slide. I hope you can see it. And since I just have 15 minutes, I'm going to talk about one irregular security problem, that is water security. Water security, yes, in this front, using a picture taken from Sri Lanka, because I visited Sri Lanka just before the outbreak of this COVID-19. It's early 2020, and since that time, okay, I have never been abroad. Okay, so 2 years has passed. Time flies in a very fast way. Anyhow, let's focus on this water security. Just now, my colleague from New Zealand just mentioned about something like Ukraine crisis is a traditional security, and of course, it's very much important. But I think in this water security is of not less significance for everyone. Maybe Ukraine is far from my country and far from the Indian Ocean, but this water, of course, your life is always approximate, okay, immediately linked with this water. So what is water security? Well, water security, according to this, the definition recommended by this UN Water, okay, in 2013, it refers to the capacity of a population to safeguard the sustainable access to adequate quantities of acceptable quality water for sustaining livelihoods, human well-being, and socio-economic development, for pursuing protection against waterborne pollution and water-related disasters, and for preserving ecosystem in a climate of peace and political stability. So the essence here is that the water security is relevant to both quantity and quality, relevant to both livelihood and economic production, and is relevant to both accessibility and sustainability, as well as health of human being and the health of ecosystem. So that is of multi-dimensional significance. And I have to say, unfortunately, we are in a global water crisis, okay, water security crisis, okay. This crisis is keep intensifying almost every day. There's water scarcity, especially in South Asia. Of course, in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, you also have such a challenge. In China, we do have water scarcity, although it's in a lesser scale. And there's a climate change and sanitation issue, pollution, and even interstate or intrastate conflict over water. As to this scarcity issue, as we can see, this is data from the World Bank. There's a declining water resource, global water resource per capita. Just a half century ago, we still have every human being on the world. They have 13,000, okay, 13,000 cubic meters of water resource every year. But since that, okay, since 60 decades ago, the per capita resource developed a downward tendency. Okay, so it's keep declining almost every year. And just last year, as we can see, not last year, 2014, the human per capita water resources less than 6,000. So it reduced a half within six decades. That is, of course, a very challenging situation. Of course, this can be partly attributed to the growth of human, global population. Okay, but there is anyhow a challenge. And for South Asia, as you can see, for the global per capita data is less than 6,000 cubic kilometers for every person. But for South Asia, it's just 1,100. Okay, so that is the case for 2014. For South Asia, the per capita water resource for South Asia is just 20% of global average. And for Sri Lanka, the situation is much better, because for Sri Lanka, you have more than 2,500 cubic meters of per capita, water resource. Anyhow, it's just 40%. Or 50% of global average. So anyhow, the whole South Asia is in a great, scarcity situation, I have to say. And climate change, as I think everyone knows that this year Pakistan suffered from a historical, flood of a historical scale, and this is the challenge. And as we know that before this flood, there was a heat wave covering the whole South Asia, especially Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. And in fact, for my city, Chengdu, southwestern part of China, we also witnessed unprecedented heat wave in middle and early August this year. Okay, and that has resulted into power failure and the reduction of power supply, and it's unprecedented, to be frank. And there's a poor sanitation, water sanitation situation. Again, as we can see, South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa falls into this worst, situation group. And what is water security challenge in South Asia? Of course, everyone has their own headache. It differs, according to this state or that state. Okay, for India's water shortage, pollution, low water use efficiency. For Pakistan, there's a heavy dependency on external, water resource. For Afghanistan, for Nepal, for Bhutan, okay, there's different challenges. But what is the case for Sri Lanka? Sri Lanka is encountered with water pollution, drinking water sanitation challenges, and also that has been a major reason for this, chronic kidney disease of unknown reasons, or called CKDU for short. And there's high seasonal and spatial variation in rainfall as a result of the monsoonal, climate patterns. So basically, Sri Lanka has a better performance in terms of water resource as compared with other South Asian neighbors. But since this is very much, there's a big, variation due to this monsoon, climate. Okay, so the real situation, the ground situation for each district is very much, different from the overall situation. And there's low water use efficiency in Sri Lanka. And in this regard, I think China and Sri Lanka have developed some cooperation. And, in fact, the two countries signed an intergovernmental memorandum of understanding to deal with water security challenges hands in hand. 7 years ago, the Chinese Academy of Science signed an MOU with Ministry of Water Supply and Drainage and Urban Development of Sri Lanka. And that is for detecting the cause of the chronic kidney disease for unknown reasons and on drinking water treatment technology. And the same year, the two sites, the Center for Environmental Science of the Chinese Academy of Science and the National Water Supply and Drainage Committee of Sri Lanka signed another agreement. And just 2 years, 2 years back, the two sides signed another supplementary agreement on water supply technology cooperation. And more importantly, there is assistance projects, and the Chinese companies are developing several water supply projects in Sri Lanka so as to provide clean drinking water to its people. And China-Sri Lanka Joint Research and Demonstration Center for Water Technology has been constructed. This construction work has started in Peladenia University several years back. And of course, the construction work is in the process. It has not been finished as yet. And there is a China-Sri Lanka Friendship National Nephrology, specialized hospital in Ponanua that is specially devoted for this chronic kidney, disease for unknown reasons, and that has been inaugurated last year, I think, by this president of Sri Lanka and the Chinese ambassador there. And this facility is, I think, one of the largest such specialized hospitals in South Asia. It can accommodate 200 hospitals in general, and it can also offer some advanced facilities. That is, of course, one of the success story. And in fact, this hospital is also a joint investment by both China and Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka also devoted some funding, and the Chinese side also devoted some, offered a grant, some, I think about 60% of the funding. Okay, so it's a joint project. And the China-Sri Lanka side also cooperate in some joint research. This is of great significance. In 2018, the China-Sri Lanka Joint Research and Demonstration Center for Water Technology has been established, and the Chinese Academy of Science sent expert teams 7 times to investigate the water quality problem in Sri Lanka. And another professor from the Chinese Academy of Science led dozens of Chinese experts to visit Sri Lanka for research on this course of this CKDU, and 150 plus experts from both countries majoring in public health, drinking water, hydrology, and environmental science joined some conference seminar jointly organized by the 2 countries. And the expert from the Chinese Academy of Science also sent to Sri Lanka in late August 2018 for the investigation of this CKDU. Okay, so that is the case. And there is also some cooperation in terms of human capital development. Of course, this is not exclusive to Sri Lanka. The Center of Excellence for Water and Environment of the Chinese Academy of Science has trained more than 100 students in more than 30 countries, inclusive of students from Sri Lanka. And the center also has an annual training course of 3 months and a short-term training course of 14 days every year, and the applicants exceed 417 in 2017. In fact, the Chinese side trained more than 6,000 personnel from Sri Lanka. Of course, this is not exclusive to water issue. Okay, this number also includes trainees for other subjects. And the 2 countries, okay.
Dr. Jen, you have 2 more minutes to complete your presentation.
Thank you. Okay. And China, Sri Lanka, the 2 countries, the cooperation is also going to offer some, water security or net security, okay, of water, okay. And they can join hands to be water security suppliers in the region. Number 1, in some unexpected emergencies like this desalination plant blast in Maldives, both China and Sri Lanka offered help hands, and this is this is also a demonstration of Sri Lanka's unique role in this Indian Ocean region. As compared with the landmass, of course, Sri Lanka is not as impressive as China or India, but Sri Lanka, anyhow, in this Indian Ocean regions, can play a very unique and constructive role due to its location strategically. And second, I think the cooperation on the CKDU control can be a major contribution by both China and Sri Lanka to the region and the world, because this CKDU is not particular to Sri Lanka. In Sri Lanka, of course, Sri Lanka is plagued by this disease, but South Asia, Southeast Asia, Latin America, Africa countries, all such, in such tropical regions, rural areas, okay, the farmers, generally speaking, they might be victims of the CKDU. Thereby, I think the China Sri Lanka cooperation in this regard is of greater significance and even of global significance. And we also can cooperate to develop Sri Lanka into a regional hub water saving and pollution control facility production center and trade center, because that is going to help to address the water pollution and water wastage issue, and it's also going to generate revenues, okay? and for, of course, the local workers, and that is will really be a win-win situation, not just for China and Sri Lanka, but also for the region, for South Asia. As Sri Lanka can, in such an effort, can be a water security, supplier, or water, or net security supplier to the region. And that is my, conclusion, of the presentation. I think water is the origin of everything, and water is the source of life. And let's share the benefit, share the responsibility, and share a common future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jain. A very important subject in the relationship between China and Sri Lanka in that regard. Sri Lanka receives 2 monsoons, and we have a reservoir network that goes back to 2 centuries. Yet we have serious problems of water during the dry season. I said 2 centuries. I'm sorry, it is not 2 centuries. It is 2,000 years. And we still have issues with regard to water. Like any other countries, even in China, we may have heard about the famous Yellow River, which used to be a very prolific water body. From time to time, it also runs dry, requiring pumping of water from nearby rivers to keep the river flowing. So water is an important subject. Our relationship is also important in that regard, the cooperation between Sri Lanka. Thank you very much for your presentation. And now I would like to invite Lieutenant Colonel Hassan Amir, Defense Advisor at the High Commission of the Republic of Maldives in Colombo, Sri Lanka. Lieutenant Colonel Hassan Amir is currently working as the Defense Advisor, serving as the Principal Director, Directorate of Plans, Policy and Resource Management. Before assuming the current post in June 2019, he worked as the Head of Awareness and Communications Department at the National Counterterrorism Center. He joined the Maldives National Defense Force in 2000. He underwent officer cadet training at the National Defense Academy, India, and Indian Military Academy. His other military training includes Staff and Techniques Grade 3 course in Malaysia, Young Officers course in India, Defense Services Staff College in India, and Basic Para Training course in Pakistan. During his 22 years of service, he had served in various command staffs and instructional positions, including as Staff Officer at Directorate of Operations and Training, Officer Commanding of MNDF Doctrine and Publications Wing. He holds Masters of Science degree in Security Studies, Master's degree in Security Studies, Terrorism, Combating Terrorism from the Naval Postgraduate School, Monterey, California, Masters in Strategic and Defense Management from University of Malaya, and a Bachelor's in Arts from the Jawaharlal Nehru University in India. With that brief introduction, may I request Lieutenant Colonel Amir to make his presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Your Excellency. Distinguished Chair, senior officers, fellow panelists, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I have a presentation which is it's just pictures for you to see. I'll be doing an oral presentation. At the outset, I would like to very briefly thank the Vice Chancellor of KDU, the organizers of this wonderful conference, for giving me the opportunity to be here and speak at this panel convened on this very timely and critical issue. Just before me and even earlier today in the morning session, we had very eminent speakers, notwithstanding the Honorable Defense Secretary General Gunaratna and the keynote speaker, the Honorable Subramanian Swamy, who addressed this very topic and who arrived at this from very insightful and very interesting angles. Before I begin proper, I must I'm obligated to say that my views are my own and do not necessarily reflect that of the Ministry of Defense of Maldives or the Maldives National Defense Force. So that's just a way of disclaimer. Yeah, next slide, please. Okay, I reflected very much on the theme of the panel, and the more I reflected on it, the more I kept coming back to this quote from Sun Tzu, who says that change is the only constant in warfare. And I think this is very timely and apt. And this is what I want to submit to you, that when we talk about national security through strategic stability, I think strategic stability is a utopian concept. It's a fantasy. We have been talking about the volatility, the complexity of the operating environment. And the challenge for security practitioners, for policymakers, for statesmen, and for all of us in uniform and even the society is to ensure national security in spite of or despite strategic instability. And that is what I want to submit to you today. And next slide, please. As had been said several times during the day, we are coming out of what can be described as a black swan event. Black swan event is something that we never anticipated. And coming into 2019, 2020, none of us anticipated the COVID-19 pandemic and that the whole world will be locked down for almost 2 years. But still, here we are. And we are coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic with increased fragility and brittleness of the state governance systems and communities. And what is more dismaying is that as countries like Maldives, as countries like Sri Lanka look to bounce back from this COVID-19 lockdown, we are again seeing a resurgence of war in Europe, extreme volatility in energy prices, and the dangers of a global recession, or at the very least a slowing down that is making recovery harder for all of us. Next slide, please. If we take stock of the past 3 years globally, the reversal of income and the loss of productivity and the wealth has meant that larger segments of the population are in weaker economic positions. Going back to the central theme when we talk about strategic stability and the convergence with national security, there are 3 systemic issues that I find most pressing. Next, the first systemic threat is climate change. Small island states like Maldives are extremely vulnerable, but so are the coastal cities and states like Colombo, like many states along the Indian subcontinent, even the coastal states of Europe, America, and elsewhere in the world, and large population centers across the globe. The scope of the destruction and the magnitude of the impact are changing almost every year. The science on climate change is changing almost every week, every month. The projections that they are making, as they get new data, it is changing very rapidly. And when we factor in second and third order effects, not only the destruction to the environment, but the impact of extreme weather events on infrastructure, on people, on their property, on livelihoods, on arable land, on cultivation, it goes beyond our computational abilities. We can only project, but our projections so far have not been able to give us a clear picture of what the future holds. And I would say that we are venturing into strategic unknowns, the known unknowns, which I'm sure some of you would know, the Rumsfeld doctrine of known knowns, known unknowns. Next slide, please. Yes, I of course put up these pictures of Maldives to encourage you to travel there because we need the money from tourism, but also to remind all of us here today that based on the latest reports by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, island havens such as Maldives and even parts of Sri Lanka and elsewhere, and several other islands in the Indo-Pacific region will not survive the end of this century. We project that many parts of Maldives, many islands will be completely submerged, or they will not be in a condition where people can live on these islands because of sea level rise and climate change. And changes that we have projected that will happen 50 or 70 years into the future are happening now, even now as we speak, and some of the trends like the deforestation, like the ocean acidification are completely irreversible as it seems. The second issue, next slide please. Can you move up ahead? Yeah. Just some more pictures of Maldives, I told you. Next issue is the intensification of the geostrategic competition. The first speaker today has talked about the Ukraine crisis and the use of possible nuclear weapons. And we have had many viewpoints on this in the morning as well, and I do not want to go into extensive details. But I would just like to submit that for small states like Maldives, and I dare say size matters for small states like Sri Lanka, like New Zealand, the calculus of how we base our relations goes beyond security, goes beyond defense, and it also is based on our unique dependencies we have with our neighbors, we have with our close historical, the fraternal ties we have with people, and also the values such as transparency, mutual interest, and the regional and global harmony which countries like Sri Lanka, countries like Maldives, we have tried very hard for many decades to preserve within this region. So our relations goes just beyond mutual security interests. Next slide, please. The third issue that I want to focus your attention is the proliferation, or rather the presence of a wider network of cross-cutting, symbiotic and deeply connected threats and challenges. Now, I would like to loosely refer to these as hybrid threats because they span from legal, quasi-legal to completely illegal. And they also contain traditional and non-traditional threats. So on one hand, you have regular armed action. On the other hand, you have the presence of malicious, violent extremist ideologies, as well as narco-trafficking, money laundering, and the use of cyber crimes and all these things. So when we talk of defense as a nation state, this is what we are contending with. We are not only contending with the traditional military threats, but we are also talking about non-traditional threats such as cyber crimes and even bioterrorism. And for countries like Maldives, small countries like Maldives, we have a very limited bandwidth. What I mean by bandwidth is the ability of our security forces, of our decision makers, to receive the information of a threat, to take action, to absorb this threat is very limited because we have limited capabilities, we have limited human capital, and we talked about capacities and capabilities in the morning, and because of these, we find that our security forces are always shuttling from one crisis to another. Next slide, please. So the question then arises, keep on pressing, I think, yeah, okay, some more, I'm sorry about this, some more, okay. So the question then arises, how do we ensure national security given the strategic instability? And what I want to submit to you is that the future of national security lies in innovation and resilience. And I will go into a bit more. Next slide, please. Innovation in technology, processes, mindsets, and our methodology are crucial to ensure an advantage against the threat vectors. It is vital that we fully harness the capabilities of artificial intelligence, cloud computing, and machine learning. Threats such as cyber attacks, economic espionage, and even future pandemic demands that we increase our ability to process immense quantities of data. The only way to scale up our computational ability is through more extensive use of artificial intelligence. And we have talked about how we can increase the capabilities. But what I want to say, especially for countries like Sri Lanka, for Maldives, where we have a limited pool of human capital, we must make innovative use of artificial intelligence, cloud computing, and machine learning, where we can leverage, where they can act as force multipliers. The second thing I want to say is that when we also have to make innovative and adaptive use of weapons and combat-oriented technology, especially for missions such as maritime domain awareness, reconnaissance, and even search and recovery. The focus is not on increasing the size of the arsenal, but making it more adaptive, more in tune with the operation and environment that we have in this region. And we are also forced to innovate our command and control structures. Looking through the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw perfect examples of how civil, military, and even communities were able to work together under one command and control structure, and they were able to be very effective. So when we talk about addressing threats such as violent extremism, drug trafficking, and other threats, we have to have similar kind of command and control structures, not only at the top, but even at the tactical field levels where many of you would be working very soon. Next slide, please. resilience, I would argue, is more important when we consider about national security. I have told you at the outset that my whole argument is that what can happen will happen, and this is, I believe very firmly in Murphy's Law. If it can go wrong, it will go wrong. So it would be naive to think that we can insulate ourselves against the threats. Rather, what I submit to you is that we should anticipate the threat. We should be able to, hopefully it will not happen, but if it happens, survive and then bounce back. The ability to sustain shocks to the system and rise back defines the strength of the institutions, the nature of the people, and the collective will. And in that regard, what I want to say is that I have been coming to Sri Lanka since I was probably 12 years old. And I have always seen Sri Lanka as a great example of resilience, especially how the country pulled up itself after independence, and then after a long campaign against the separatist movement, and even after the Easter Sunday bombings. And the present times are hard indeed, but what it has demonstrated is the ability of institutions, the discipline of the armed forces, the police, and the spirit of the people. And I think this perfectly encapsulates the kind of resilience that we are looking for against future threats. And resilience is very broad, and what we can look at it from several angles, but I want to particularly emphasize societal resilience. And in Maldives, what we have observed is that after the 2004 tsunami, the islands that bounced back the quickest, that were able to get prosperity and economic activities going on, were the islands on which social structures, family bonds, community ties were stronger. Similarly, when we look at patterns of violent extremism, drug use spread across Maldives, we see that islands which have people who are practicing social values much better than other islands, they are able to withstand these pressures, they are able to, and their willingness to report these things to the authorities and work with the authorities to eradicate these from their islands is much stronger. And as a, next slide please, as a way of closing, I want to circle back to the complex and volatile strategic landscape. And
Colonel Amir, you have 2 minutes to complete your presentation.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. And what I want to say is that we have, in the morning, we heard a little bit about this, the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. And we have always seen the Millennium Development Goals and Sustainable Development Goals as developmental goals. But what I see them as is they are blueprints for security. And when we place the human individual at the center, when we place the community at the center, and then build the whole network of services, security, infrastructure, and resources around that, then it becomes the perfect model to ensure not only national security, but the regional and international security. And as a closing, I want to say the best bet for nation states in this volatile, complex, uncertain, ambiguous environment is to focus on innovation, be resilient, and then foster resilience as a means to sustain, survive, and thrive. And once again, my deepest gratitude to the organizers, to the Chancellor, Vice Chancellor of KDU, and respected Chairman. I yield back the floor to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation on a very important subject, national security through stability. We are actually about 20 minutes behind time, unfortunately. So let me introduce the next speaker, my old friend, Shanaka Jayasekara, Program Coordinator, Southeast Asia and the Pacific for the Global Maritime Crime Program of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, based in Bangkok, Thailand. He will be speaking from Thailand. Shanaka Jayasekara is the Program Coordinator for Southeast Asia and the Pacific for the Global Maritime Crime Program of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, based in Thailand. He has been with UNODC since 2013 and served in several field offices. Prior to his posting in Bangkok, Shanaka served as the Program Coordinator, Indian Ocean region, heading the Indian Ocean team of the Global Maritime Crime Program based in Colombo. Sri Lanka from 2017 to 2019. The Indian Ocean team supported maritime law enforcement agencies of littoral states, counter illicit activity at sea, engagement in 11 Indian Ocean states. The Southern Route Partnership and the Trilateral Strategy were key initiatives established in the region to counter heroin trafficking on the southern route. Prior to joining UNODC, he was a lecturer at the Center for Policing, Intelligence and Counterterrorism at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. He is a Chevening Scholar and has a Master's in International Security Studies from St Andrews University in Scotland and BCom from Griffith University in Brisbane, Australia. You have the floor, Shanaka.
Thank you very much, Mr. Goonetilleke. And firstly, let me thank Mr. General Milinda Peiris and Dr. Harindra Vidanage and yourself, Mr. Goonetilleke, for giving me the opportunity to speak at this conference. I must qualify at the very beginning that the comments and views expressed today are my own and do not in any way reflect the views of the organization I work for. These are personal views that I'm expressing. The topic we'll speak on is national security through strategic stability, taking examples from the region I currently work in, which is Southeast Asia, and the implications for Sri Lanka. As you quite rightly pointed out, I was a lecturer at Macquarie University, in Sydney, Australia, and it has been quite some time since I've been able to lecture to students, and I really do appreciate this opportunity where I have a place to lecture to students because I really miss that forum. But what universities do is to encourage critical thinking. So in my presentation, I will not be giving any answers or be prescriptive in any way, but presenting to you questions so that you, as the next generation of leaders in Sri Lanka, can answer and take Sri Lanka forward. So the purpose of this is to generate and develop your critical thinking and find answers. Much of my presentation will be on traditional security, which is an area that is of interest to me and my area of, I wouldn't say expertise, but knowledge. If I look at the security architecture in Southeast Asia, I'll spend only a short time on it, and I don't want to take too much time. This region gravitated from the previous Cold War history of having SEATO, which is the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, and groupings such as the Five Powers grouping. It progressed to developing a wider, inclusive economic quasi-security engagement through mechanisms such as ASEAN, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and APEC. Now, with ASEAN and APEC, these are excellent mechanisms for regional cooperation, and in terms of economic stability and economic integration, they have worked very well. But you're seeing cracks appear. And here again, if I take APEC, APEC includes countries such as Russia and China and the United States and Japan. And currently, it's hard to see how these countries can work on economic cooperation when the current political dynamics are at play. Similarly, groupings such as ASEAN have been working very tirelessly to try and develop a code of conduct on the South China Sea, but cracks have appeared within ASEAN, and that has still, or is still in the works. So what we can take from this is that nothing is permanent. While over periods of time, things work, then power balances change, and new for mechanisms and new approaches arrive. And now we have seen the Quad and AUKUS. Would they eclipse ASEAN or they won't? We don't know. These are some of the critical thinkings that you need to take into account. These are questions. Where does Quad fit in with ASEAN? What happens to APEC? So it is important to understand that nothing should remain perpetual in terms of security or strategic policy. And I also refer to the multi-directional foreign policy adopted by Vietnam as something for young students to look at as a way forward in terms of new approaches to foreign policy. So, as I said, what does this all mean for national security in Sri Lanka? It means that we must also look at new and changing approaches. Now, Sri Lanka has remained in its non-aligned groove. And I'm not saying that being non-aligned and remaining neutral is bad. All I'm saying is, has this benefited Sri Lanka? Or is there another approach? And this is what young people, young professionals moving into the national security sector as well as the strategic foreign policy sector need to think. And many of you, if I ask you the question, what is national security? Do we know what the primary threats to Sri Lanka are? I mean, I'm sure many of you may have done essays and dissertations of what is the primary threat to Sri Lanka. To first talk about national security, you need to know what are the primary threats. What are the primary threats, and how do you then work backwards to identify how you develop national security and your foreign policy to address those primary threats? Sri Lanka has, and again, not being critical, it's difficult to find a document that has a consistent foreign policy for Sri Lanka, but it has been pretty much a muddled through type approach. And one of the things that I would try and derive is that the recent speech of President Ranil Wickremesinghe on the 14th of September at the National Defense College, where he said, Sri Lanka will not take part in big power rivalry. We do not want to be the punching bag. Now, is this the best approach? It's a fantastic cliche. It's lovely to be loved by everybody and not take any sides. But is this what Sri Lanka needs right now? And as I mentioned, the power balances are shifting. When the superpowers were distant, when it was the United States 7,000, 8,000 miles away, or when it was the USSR way far away from Sri Lanka, it was fantastic to have a non-aligned policy because these were issues that were way outside our realm. But has the tectonic plates changed? Has things changed, and should we remain non-aligned? These are questions. I do not have the answers, and I'm not going to give answers. This is what critical thinking is all about. Ask yourself, as young students, what is Sri Lanka's primary threat to national security? Is it an adversarial state? Is Sri Lanka planning to fight India or anybody else? Sri Lanka can't. Is it an internal issue of disintegration? Is that the primary threat? Is it non-traditional threats? What is the primary threat Sri Lanka faces? And based on that, Sri Lanka needs to work on its national security and foreign policy. I would give you some views, and may not be the right ones. Again, these are open questions. I see Sri Lanka becoming more and more isolated globally. And this is a result of what I refer to as diaspora challenges. Sri Lanka has a very large diaspora outside of Sri Lanka. And it's a growing electoral influence in many of the key powerful countries. Now, is that a challenge to Sri Lankan national security, a challenge to Sri Lankan foreign policy? Is that something that Sri Lanka needs to address? The diaspora can be an opportunity. The diaspora can be also a challenge. Sri Lanka has very weak political structures. And at the moment, there is no legislation in place to address issues of foreign governments funding political parties. Can Sri Lanka be hijacked to cause a threat to neighboring states? In Australia, very recently, they implemented legislation that prevented foreign governments from funding political parties. Sri Lanka does not have that. And there have been instances in which foreign governments have been funding political parties and political leaders to run for office with vested interest. So could Sri Lanka be hijacked to threaten a neighboring state? So these are some of the issues that you need to address. Now, in that element, in that global atmosphere of a change in power politics that have now changed from distant issues where the global powers were distant to Sri Lanka, it has come to our backyard. Current global threats, global powers are in our backyard, in the Indo-Pacific region. So in that situation, should we remain non-aligned? Should we remain aligned in an alignment that is divergent from where the dissident diaspora is aligned? Would that be not beneficial to us? Should we be aligned or non-aligned in a situation where it causes insecurity to India? Because the recent events that Mr. Goonetilleke referred to did cause concerns to India. And can we continue to do that? And is there an opportunity for us to take advantage of Indian economic growth? So these are issues that we need to think through and where our alignment sits. We believe, and I think this has been the kind of traditional belief in Sri Lanka, that we must not be a punching bag for everybody. We must be non-aligned. We must be neutral. We must be, remain non-aligned to anybody because we can maximize the benefits in an international fallout. But consider the expanding influence of India globally. Can we remain non-aligned or aligned on the wrong side in such a global situation? So, as I said, I am not presenting answers. I am posing questions for you to think critically, because we have had this non-aligned process since its inception and even beyond. We missed the whole period of the Marshall Plan and the development and the capital distribution through the Asian Development Bank into Southeast Asia. We missed that whole period because of our alignments and non-alignments or lack of alignments. We don't have a single international agency headquartered in Colombo because we have no alignment with anybody. And already embassies are leaving Colombo and departing because Sri Lanka is no longer a relevant player in the region. So
you have 2 minutes to complete your presentation.
Yeah. Is this the right approach? So in conclusion, in reality, has non-aligned approach benefited Sri Lanka? It's an open question, and I don't have the answer. Is there an alternate approach that will benefit Sri Lanka's national interest? And if there is, I would ask the younger generation, because all of us who are old and have now finished off have messed up big time for you. The younger generation needs to take a look at this afresh and see where the best interest of Sri Lanka lies. Thank you very much. Back to you, Mr. Goonetilleke.
Thank you very much for that presentation, very, very interesting indeed. More questions than answers, and I hope during the next session we will be able to pose questions with regard to the issues raised by him and others. Our final speaker is Dr. Chris Ogden, who is the senior lecturer, associate professor, researcher, and author specializing in India, China, and Asia's rise to worldwide importance and the study of great power politics. Based in the School of International Relations at the University of St. Andrews, he also works as a public commentator who shares his long-standing expertise with a range of audiences in order to improve their understanding of important dynamics in the contemporary world. Building engagements on topic of global significance, Chris actively enhances our appreciation of current affairs in a compelling, energetic, and interesting manner. Driven by a deep curiosity and enthusiasm, his books, other writings, invited talks, media and consultancy activities collectively enrich our awareness, knowledge and thinking as a society. He has previously taught at the University of Edinburgh, the University of Glasgow, and Durham University, as well as the Chinese University of Hong Kong. He is recognized as a fellow of the UK Higher Education Academy and has been appointed a senior research fellow with the Foreign Policy Centre in London, as an honorary fellow in the Centre for South Asian Studies, and as a visiting scholar at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. In 2018, he founded the European Scholars of South Asian International Relations Research Network and annual conference. With that introduction, I would like to invite Dr. Ogden to make his presentation.
Pleasure to be here. Greetings from Scotland, and my kind thanks to the organisers of this event. So I just want to kind of build upon what many of the presenters have said, but kind of pull out a bit. So we talked about all these different dynamics, the different kind of security issues in the system at the moment, issues in Ukraine, issues to do with water, but also in particular, the last speaker, issues about roles and what countries want or where to go with those roles and what to do within international dynamics. So I'm going to try and take quite a big kind of macro view of the big changes that are happening in the system and really just pose for the audience, where do countries lie? What are they going to do within these dynamics? And also just think about the big dynamics in terms of where solutions are coming from. Some of these are doing with changing balances of power. The very obvious ones in the Indo-Pacific are the huge rise of China, which I will deal with by talking about the shadow of China, in terms of that's making up part of state strategic thinking and their understanding. But equally, also the rise of India, but as kind of inconsistency for India in certain ways, certainly in terms of its region, but also in terms of its overall standing. But that standing is increasing. It is often used to balance out against China in kind of classic balance of power, kind of realism, kind of dynamics. But overall, there's this shifting dynamic, there's a redefinition happening, and as the previous speaker mentioned, small states are caught within this. Which way do they turn? But equally, it's going to be these big states who are going to hopefully provide the answers to the most pressing international issues in different ways. The other things I would also add are perceptions are critical here. Do we see other states as foes for particular reasons? Do we see them as rivals? Do we see them as friends? Often this is highly double-edged. Again, I think China is a fantastic example here. Chinese investment is needed by lots of states across South Asia and elsewhere, but equally that can be seen as a kind of encroaching threat over time. and particularly if you look through the kind of prism of Chinese military spending. And then my other final observation for today will be also just to think about political ideologies, but also personalities. It seems from my side, on a global scale, in a way, we're in an era of kind of quite big, kind of strongman politics. So you have Xi in China, who next month more than likely will stay in power for another 5, 10, 15 plus years. Within South Asia, Modi looks almost certain to win the next election, if not the election after that. We still have Putin in Russia. And in the United States, depending upon what happens in November, also in 2 months' time, we might have a return of Trump or some kind of Trump-esque figure. So all things to think about. So first of all, the shadow of China. The big thing here is these deep-seated interdependencies which are happening within South Asia, emanating back up towards East Asia. The obvious bits of this are the Belt and Road Initiative and the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor as part of that. My big observation here is that in many ways this is eroding what we mean traditionally by South Asia as a geographically distinct region. It's linking South Asia and pulling South Asia into the Indo-Pacific. Moreover, it's also challenging the conception, at least from the viewpoint of New Delhi, that South Asia is where India is the natural hegemon, the unchallenged hegemon. But because of economics, and also I would argue because of energy security, and as one of the speakers mentioned earlier, water security, that is slowly dissipating, that claim to that kind of natural dominance. Beyond that, it also makes within Indian foreign policy, the India-China dynamic, really the major inflection point. In many ways, some analysts are also saying that that's superseding India-Pakistan as being the major kind of go-to or kind of critical juncture, as it were, in relations. And this is particularly important because both of them want to be great powers, and key to them being great powers is not necessarily material power, which it is, but really it's also about prestige, respect, recognition, and a wider kind of question about who's leading Asia, which I would say Beijing definitely thinks it's them, and New Delhi isn't always keen to take that kind of position, as it were. Overall, this means that the shadow of China is definitely a big driver for Indian foreign policy and diplomacy. It's forcing India to be more proactive. Again, as earlier speakers have noted, maybe it should force other states to be more proactive, or at least more reflective about where they are, what they want, where they want to be. And it also points to a deep rivalry between the two. So far, Beijing's done a very good job of really kind of outshining India, even in its own backyard. Beyond that, though, clearly India's star is rising. It is becoming, on some levels, a great power. We can argue about whether that's definitely true or not true concerning different measures, but certainly I would say the perception of India's importance has never been bigger or larger in different ways. And one key reason for this is because other states want to use India to balance out against China. So again, kind of pushing the significance of India because of China, and therefore increasing the significance of the region overall. Much of this is because of the shared threat perception. China is a shared other. But equally, also, it's a way of, for India, offsetting its loss of power in South Asia. If it can gain more power in the wider Indo-Pacific, AUKUS, other organisations, then it can boost its power in different ways. So again, it's this ongoing relative kind of dynamic, relative interface kind of between the two in different ways. What's interesting from my side is that there's also a deep strategic confluence there. India wants to be great, it wants to be of significance, and other states are helping it. They're engendering it, they're enabling it, they're facilitating it in different ways. Very briefly, you can see here how India is quite indispensable for the foreign policy calculations of others. The F and the R are France and Russia, so crucial in terms of them selling military equipment to New Delhi, but also in terms of nuclear energy, space collaboration. Both sides are also supporting India in terms of their position in Kashmir. With Japan and the United States, an ongoing critical trade partner, military partner, the mutual ties between all three of them also help. And at the very end, I think just a note on where New Delhi is. It's been a surprise for observers in Europe to see how close India is to Russia, but really this is an indication of New Delhi being a kind of, as I put it here, a kind of wily chameleon. They're able to have very good relations with nearly all states in different domains at the same time. They're neither really one way or the other way. This is partly to do with India's status inconsistencies, I would say, but it's also to do with, I think, a diplomatic flexibility, which again suggests that you can get different things from different relations simultaneously. You don't need to declare that you're one thing or you're another thing. Finally, a little bit more briefly, India, certainly Indian politics are becoming dominated by Modi, by the BJP and by Hindutva, i.e. Hindu nationalism. And this is adding a different kind of style or tone to the way that India is conducting its foreign policy. Certainly concerning ideas of Indian exceptionalism, also the kind of more open othering of minorities within India, but also this kind of a greater kind of nationalist sense of threat from India, threat from China in terms of its territory, and a kind of a much more kind of emotional kind of foreign policy. One notable thing here is, and this I think is maybe seeping into the politics of other states within the region, is that this Hindutva has a kind of global magnetism. Certainly it's quite popular amongst the various Indian diasporas. Certainly research I've seen that's very true in the United States, but it's also showing its head in different ways. In the UK, for example, there's a city called Leicester, and the other week there was unrest between Hindus and Muslims, which historically had never happened. And many observers noted this was because of a kind of injection of Hindutva in different ways. So really that's pointing to a kind of globalized sense of that identity being important. But moreover, I would say at the very bottom, kind of emboldening India's wider influence and status on the international system. So again, really kind of a bit like the previous presenter in a way and the other presenters, kind of posing more questions like where's the region going and where are states going to position themselves within these dynamics, or what's the best way of dealing with these dynamics in different ways. But I'll leave it there. I'm very aware of the time, and I'm sure along with all the other presenters, I look forward to all questions and comments. Thank you very much.
We have exceeded the time limitation. We have kept 4 presentations by about 20 minutes. Therefore, we can now move on to the questions and answer session. And there are several questions that have already been posed. Let me go to the chat box. Yes. First one is to Dr. Zeng. And it was highlighted that next generation of warfare is determined by resource scarcity, especially drinking water. How do you see this matter as an issue of cooperation than conflict? I will go to the other questions after listening to the response of Dr. Zeng. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much. So this is a very interesting question. I mentioned about what cooperation instead of conflict, but to be frank, conflict, the potential for conflict, even a major military conflict, the danger, okay, is always there, okay. So, but I want to say, first, when we consider this water security issue, we need to go beyond this scarcity or shortage, paradigm. Paradigm is just, shortage or scarcity is just one part of this water security or insecurity. But there's other issues like, for example, the pollution, okay, the climate change. It's not so relevant to shortage, right? If you always focus on the shortage, okay, then there's a limited amount of water. Either you have this water or either I have this water, but we can hardly have both this amount of water. So you have to be, somewhat lead to this, think about conflict. However, if you think beyond this scarcity or shortage, okay, when you consider the sanitation issue, when you consider this water pollution issue, okay, when you consider this climate change, okay, then it became something can be shared, okay. So this is number one. We need to reframe our paradigm, okay, of thinking. We can't just think narrowly always on this scarcity or shortage. This is number one. And number two, even if for this water shortage or water, resource itself, okay, we have some success stories, success, like between India and Pakistan. We know that India and Pakistan has not so good relation in the past 7 decades, but for this Indus water river sharing, they do have this one of the most successful story around the world. That is the Indus Water Treaty. Yes, that treaty was signed almost 6 decades ago and has operated, has survived 2 major India and Pakistan wars, survived many interstate conflict, survived many tensions between India and Pakistan. So there is major differences of the 2 countries over almost all the major issues, but when they consider this Indus Water River Treaty, they want to keep this, both India and Pakistan want to keep this treaty there and working. That is to say, even between major countries with major differences like India and Pakistan, they could develop cooperation in terms of reasonable water resource sharing. So that is possible. And to be frank, this water, conflict sometimes is more, I think more, just an instrument, okay, or it's a bargaining chip, bargaining chip, okay. For example, when Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, okay, they have the differences. Everyone used to, just wage a threat of war. However, no military conflict between or among the 3 countries, because they just want to use this paradigm, okay, this imminent threat of war as an instrument for political, for diplomatic, negotiation. Okay, so that is a case. I am somewhat optimistic in this regard. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next question is to Professor Azizian about the Ukraine crisis. It has now become a global issue, and how do you see the role of New Zealand resolving this type of crisis? If you can devote about a minute or 2 to respond, that will be helpful. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm not sure resolving is the word I would use. I think this is a crisis that will continue for some time, and I don't think we can see it resolved fully. But mitigating and somehow reducing the implications of that conflict in the region and worldwide would be something worth doing. So New Zealand is a small country, obviously, and if you follow a particular school of thought, you may say, who cares what New Zealand thinks or does? But as I mentioned earlier, a collection of smaller states with principled positions can make a difference. We have seen that historically before, and we shouldn't give up, and we should, I would just like to, support some previous commentary by my colleagues about the need to do something and not just try to play traditional roles sitting in between. So we are a small country, but we have a rather popular prime minister, if you agree. And interestingly, Jacinda Ardern gained her reputation internationally successfully dealing, according to many, with non-traditional issues. So if you are doing some good work and gaining reputation dealing with non-traditional, perhaps you can also be, received and respected more dealing with the traditional crisis like war. New Zealand provides some military support, limited, obviously modest, to Ukraine. It has entered the sanctions regimes against Russia, but very importantly, for New Zealand, this is an example how the rule of law is violated internationally and how multilateral institutions like Security Council, United Nations are not responding adequately to the crisis. So New Zealand for a long time has been suggesting a reform of the UN Security Council, and luckily we now see some of the major powers like United States agreeing that the reform of the Security Council is overdue. So this is perhaps a combination of things that New Zealand is doing, but most importantly, New Zealand is encouraging other countries to follow and do something about the Ukraine war. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Since we are running out of time, may I ask from the audience whether there are any questions? If there are any, please introduce yourself and make the question as short as possible so that we can find some time to get a response. That do not seem to be the case. If that is the case, the next what we have to do is to have a panel discussion and summing up by the chair. We had a very interesting 5 presentations, one personally from the podium over here and 4 others from various corners of the world, and we are very happy for their presence and their involvement with the subject. We have discussed Ukrainian war, water security, national security through stability, India and the Indo-Pacific and related subjects. The most important, I think, burning issue today is the Ukrainian crisis. I really do not know whether we know the reason for this crisis. Some believe it is would like to place the fault on the lapse of NATO, saying that they went beyond the area which was originally agreed between the former Soviet Union and the NATO. The others have other things, that is saying that Ukrainian decision to seek membership in the EU and more so with regard to the NATO were the reasons for the war. However, if you study the situation very carefully, you will see that that particular war did not start this year or last year in February. It started in February, went on for so many months, and the problem is actually the Russians do not believe that it is a war. They say it is an operation against Ukraine. But if you look into the history of the conflict, I think we can go back to 2014. One can say that is where the origins of the problem, when the Russians moved into certain parts of eastern Ukraine and to Crimea. And others come with the idea that it was the belief of President Putin that Ukraine is not an independent sovereign country. It has no role to be there in the first place. It is an accident or a deliberate movement, and he eventually find fault with the time when the Russian Revolution took place, because they believe that they should not have allowed Ukraine to become a separate entity as it did in 1920s and later in 1990s. So There appears to be a grandiose plan on the part of the President Putin to absorb Ukraine back into the Soviet Union or to the current present day Russia. And the question is, if that is allowed to happen, where he will end up is the issue. So I think we have not seen, or not even closer to the end of the Ukraine war. It will go on for a while, considerable period of time, and how it is going to end up is something what we have no idea. Water security is another subject that we discussed. It's a very timely issue. As I said, Sri Lanka and China is cooperating in this particular field. We have 2 monsoons. Despite these 2 monsoons, we also go through a period of drought, which affects production, particularly the agricultural sector. We are blessed with a vast number of reservoirs that were constructed many centuries ago. Some of them are functioning, and many hundreds of smaller reservoirs are unfortunately silted and not in operating condition or optimum operation condition. As such, there is a scarcity even in the dry zone where the reservoirs used to be. And then, of course, we have come across of this particular problem of illness related to kidney, and China has very graciously made available a hospital to address this particular problem. And I don't think we have seen the end of this medical situation what our farmers are facing in the dry zone, and a lot of work will be required to identify where we are and how we are going to address this particular issue. Then, of course, national security through stability, I don't have to say much. Sri Lanka having faced certain situation during the last couple of months, we know what it is like to live in an unstable kind of background or an environment, and I hope the government will be able to address that kind of situations, not only to curtail unstable situations, but also to understand how such situations originate and progress. So we have also to address what you call the root causes of these problems. There was also a subject relating to traditional security, Sri Lanka and its policy. A couple of years ago, when President Gotabaya Rajapaksa was inaugurated as president from Anuradhapura, he made a statement saying that Sri Lanka will be a neutral country. I really do not know whether we have gone any or made any studies with regard to the kinds of neutral countries we have in the world. There are many types, and I think beyond that particular statement, we have not done much work to understand the pros and cons of being neutral. And the most important thing is, in this present climate, whether there is room for neutral countries to exist. Because if there are powerful countries in the neighborhood which would find our neutrality affects their national interest, then there will be repercussions for us to face. And we do not know what in such situation what would happen. So neutrality is good. We say non-alignment is no more, but of course one can say non-alignment is an extension of neutrality, which has become, I think, outdated today. But the whole question is whether we have the facility or the freedom to be aligned is the question that we will have to answer. or whether we should be non-aligned. These are subjects that we should focus on and study. Then, of course, Dr. Ogden spoke about the India and the Indo-Pacific. Indo-Pacific is a new terminology. Can't say exactly a new terminology because Australians were using Indo-Pacific in the way back in 1960s. And the whole idea of Indo-Pacific came into being in 1920s. But of course, as a strategic measure, Indo-Pacific can be said it is a creation that has roots in 1920s, discussed even in 1960s, highlighted in 2007 by late Prime Minister Abe, Shinzo Abe. He in 2007 in India he made reference to the subject, and about 10 years later in Kenya he gave a new twist to the free and open Indo-Pacific, which was later borrowed by the United States. Secretary of State Tillerson started speaking about it, and his successors continued to speak about it until such time President Trump embraced the whole idea. Then it became the property or the possession of the United States, which they promote. So there are, a lot of things happening around us, and as students following these kind of subjects, there is much to discuss, much to learn, and much to research on. And I hope this particular session was useful to you all in your studies and in your future career. Thank you very much. If there is nothing else, we can adjourn the meeting. Thank you for your presence.
That was a very interesting and lively discussion. And I believe we will all leave this auditorium with much food for thought.
I would like to once again thank the Chairperson, Ambassador Bernard Goonetilleke, for gracing the second plenary session of Defence and Strategic Studies with his presence amidst his busy schedule. I would also like to thank the distinguished speakers of the second plenary for Defence and Strategic Studies, Professor Rouben Azizian, Dr. Zeng Xiangyu, Lieutenant Colonel Hassan Amir, Mr. Shanaka Jayasekara, Dr. Chris Ogden, for sharing their thoughts on the theme National Security through Strategic Stability.
I would like to call upon Major General Lal Gunasekara, Rector of KDU Metropolitan Campus, accompanied by Colonel Pradeep Ratnayaka, Dean, Faculty of Defence and Strategic Studies, to present their token of appreciation to Ambassador Bernard Goonetilleke, the plenary chair of the session 2.
I would like to call upon Ambassador Bernard Goonetilleke to receive the token of appreciation.